No, I mean, architecture is political. We gotta add that stuff.
Indeed.
We're tearing down communities to build multifamily, and you have to understand we are creating displacement. You're displacing Black and brown folks, and they don't come back.
Half of this podcast would be dedicated to the history of Powerhouse, my journey and my discoveries, and hey, I'm going to solve this housing problem.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Melissa Daniels. This is the Architecture is Political podcast where Black and brown folks talk about architecture. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and be part of my storytelling. You know how long I've been wanting to talk to Adam? Last year, I had reached out to him on Instagram and life happened so rapidly for him. Finally, I didn't even count the months. I want to say it's like 8 months later. I want to say 8 months. Adam, 8 months. But it's well worth it. You don't understand. Like, this conversation is really enriched and you really hear his thought process and his passion for what he does with Segregated by Design. I thoroughly enjoy talking to people who are passionate about things. And Adam is passionate about his research. In the beginning, he talked a little bit, and then we got a little debate about cars. And I thought about taking it out because I always have this debate whether I should just let the person speak, like I ask a question and then they talk, or just insert as much of the conversation as, so what you hear is mostly what we talked about. That, that's recorded anyway. It's a debate because the majority of you will side with Adam. I feel that my reasoning didn't really come out as clearly as I wanted it to come out. And I didn't want to add myself or thoughts into the total conversation. So what you hear is what you hear. So the debate on cars, and my stance is that there's a war on cars right now. Every social media outlet that I'm on, I hear people talk about how cars are bad and you need to walk or bike. And I'm not against that at all. Like, you live in a city like DC. DC is a walkable city. DC is a bikeable city. You should use public transportation. But public transportation in DC, the metro, it's horrible. It sucks. Like, you waiting 20 minutes for a train and you could have walked there by now. I am 1,000% on board with walking and biking and reducing the pollution that is cars. But I'm always skeptical of when a certain demographic say that we should get rid of cars. And I pause for a second. I think about, how does Black and brown people use cars? Because at some point in time, public transportation was deemed as only poor people. Black and brown people use public transportation. And, for the same reasons why there's no metro in Georgetown, because they don't want those people to be in that area. And I guess that always stuck by me growing up in DC. There's a DC history class you got to take in high school. And I had a cool ass DC history teacher who taught a lot of stuff. Talk about the Black history of DC. I plumb forgot about most of it, but the thing that stuck with me was just Georgetown and how they fought against having a metro station down there. So you have to get off at Foggy Bottom and walk. And it's a good walk. And now they're like kicking themselves because they want a system there. I am skeptical with cars being eliminated in cities and how the cities themselves are penalizing you for having a car, whether you park the car and you didn't read the sign, because the signs are meant to be confusing. Like, I remember watching that parking show, that reality parking show in Philly, Parking Wars. I forgot the name of it. Anyway, it always infuriated me because of the whole process. You need a PhD to read parking signs. But I just feel it penalizes Black and brown people more for just simply having a car. But yet you don't want us to live in the city also because we can't afford it. So, this was my mindset in talking to Adam about it. And he is 1,000% right in what he said. And, it's me, so I think I'm right too. So just listen to it, guys. Like I said, I think my listeners is going to side with Adam versus me. And I say that because I haven't, in that debate or that conversation, I didn't really formulate my thoughts and really hit it with hard data because it's a feeling. Oh yeah, so listen to that part, take it with a grain of salt. It's a conversation between Adam and I, and if you want to DM me on IG and you're like, Melissa, you were absolutely wrong, you can state your case in my DMs. Again, it's all about love. Let's see what else. A lot has happened in the real world. And I thought about doing a separate podcast, just talking about it and just me talking. I haven't done that in a long time. But I have to put it out there when it's fresh in people's minds. When I talked to Adam, that's when the Buffalo Massacre happened. I thought that maybe we should talk about it, how it related to Segregated by Design, and that supermarket it being closed is now like a food desert. Black people access to food. When you eliminate that food desert, we have to travel. Twitter, I'm going to briefly mention this. Someone on Twitter proposed eliminating Hechinger Mall to put up affordable housing, quote unquote affordable housing. Or something similar like Union Market. And that just got me hot because I remember, again, I'm a DC girl. So I remember when Hechinger Mall was like the Home Depot, Hechinger's was the Home Depot. And just going there and getting, like, my mom would take me and getting, just, I don't know, paint. I can't remember what she got there for. Or like the grocery store. Safeway has always been, was it always Safeway? I think it was always Safeway. Was always there. I remember Payless shoes. I remember like the $10 store. Okay, it's like the Rainbows. It's a mall, but it's an outdoor type mall thing. It's not indoor mall. It's an outdoor mall thing. And so when I saw this guy proposing to eliminate this area, and it has a lot of surface parking. Again, like, here we go with the parking. Yeah, and I agree, it does have a lot of surface parking. And to build on it and just revamp that. And I got hot. And let me tell you why I got hot. I got hot because, that's the last resemblance of blackness. That whole mall is black. He's proposing to turn into Union Market. I've been to Union Market a whole bunch of times. And recently, the owner decided that kids could not be there anymore. Like the middle or high school kids are allowed there without a parent. And so what he meant was that the black and brown kids, which is around there, could not frequent there without parents. I remember getting kicked out of places because we were too loud, or, someone may have stole something, or they may be harassing people. But that's what kids do. Like, I didn't harass people, but I was in that group of that people that would harass. But anyway, that reminded me of that, the policing of black and brown bodies. You're not allowed here. Here's some restrictions only for you, right? So that reminded me of that when I saw that tweet. And I just liked what other people had said that had similar feelings for me. I didn't put my 2 cents in. That's why I have a podcast, because I could put my 2 cents in. So yeah, so I'm gonna end. I've been talking for a while. It's been a while, guys. It's been a while since I talked to you. So I'm going to stop talking and let Adam talk. Okay, hope you enjoy. Hey, Adam.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You want to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Adam Paul Susaneck. I work in architecture. I'm based in New York City. I run the account Segregation by Design on Instagram and Twitter. Hoping to maybe make a book or publish eventually. I have the site as well. And I am here to talk about the history of American cities.
You are really passionate about what you post. What do you want to talk about first?
I'll just start with the motivation, because that's what everyone's always interested in, especially because I'm a cis hetero white dude. Well, I mean, I want to be upfront about that because I recognize that I personally have benefited from the exact things that I'm talking about, in terms of generational wealth and knowledge and memory. But yeah, I mean, my motivation is, well, having studied architecture and having been interested in city planning, but but specifically having studied architecture, it gave me the tools and the language and the skills to really analyze the built environment critically. And the more I did that in American cities, the more I was like, what the hell is going on here? I knew redlining and I knew the effects theoretically. And then I read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, which is, everyone should read that. It basically inspired this project because it really summed up a lot of things very succinctly. And I think that's what's so fantastic about that book is it's very much like a compendium. It's short though, of just segregation tactics. But what I found frustrating as an architect is there's not enough pictures. There's not any pictures. I'm a very, very visual person, and what he's talking about is so visual. And it's the same with the power broker. I'm not going to, pretty much everyone listening to this podcast is going to know about the power broker. Here's a trick. You don't have to read it consecutive. You can find what I do is I just go in, okay, I need to talk about the Cross Bronx. I'll just go in there. I'm trying to learn about the built history of New York. I don't necessarily need to know about Robert Moses's swim team experiences. I love Robert Caro, but he's a little encyclopedic, which is a virtue. I've probably read 60% of that book. I haven't read the whole thing. But even in that book, there's only like a couple pictures. I just wanted to sort of potentially add to the understanding through pictures because it's how a lot of us learn. I like a good meme that also conveys a lot of information because I think there's a use in ease of digestibility of the information because a lot of it is so like arcane. Another motivation, in addition to sort of just wanting pictures, I used to give this answer as a joke, but I was trying to figure out, I'm a train nerd. I think that comes across in the Instagram sometimes. I wanted to figure out where the streetcars went, the trolleys, because I know every American city used to have streetcars and it's somewhat alive in the collective memory, like the trolley problem and the streetcar named Desire, but like they're mostly gone. And I used to say that as a joke, like I was trying to figure out where they went. And it turns out, the farther you look down into it, it's because of a divestment in cities for racial reasons. But I realized I read then Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, which is excellent if you haven't read. So she uses so the central metaphor of her book is the public swimming pool. During the New Deal, the federal government funded the construction of public swimming pools in basically every city of a certain size as part of the WPA. And this was when public meant like Beaux-Arts, like Grand, like New York Public Library, public. And so there were these big, beautiful structures, but they were whites only, they were segregated. And this was the 30s. So then the 50s come around, and when desegregation comes down from the courts, rather than integrate the pools, many of the cities, they specifically say this is because they don't want to integrate. They drain them, they demolish them, they're gone. You subsequently see a rise in pools in backyards in private homes. And so in that instance, a public good is privatized. And ultimately, it was an anti-Black measure. But who loses is everybody, because we lose everybody but the rich who can afford a pool in their house. And that's what happened with the streetcars. That was a public good, mobility. I mean, it was a private company, but it provided a public good to everybody. You think about who can drive a car. Sorry, well, that's a different issue. But they demand a public good, the transportation system. And so you have to go buy a car, is what they said. Oh, you had a trolley that came every 5 minutes. Now here's a bus, comes every hour.
I didn't know about the pool situation. I knew about segregation, but I didn't know that it brought the rise of the backyard pool.
Well, especially in the North, because in southern cities, it was kind of a trend, the above ground thing. But no, it was public pools. That was a big part of America, but they're just gone now. And back to the point of transportation, in particular, the trams, the streetcars, who can ride a streetcar? A lot of them are segregated, yes. Although in many northern cities, they get desegregated. In New York, the omnibuses were desegregated in, I think, 1868. I forget the woman's name. And absolutely discriminated against. But the fact of the matter is, everyone can use the streetcars. Who can drive? Sober adults between the ages of like 16 and like 70.
I'm glad you're mentioning this. Hear me out here. Is my perspective. So now there's a war on cars, right? Like I've seen on Twitter, especially.
That podcast actually just reached out to me yesterday. So I love them.
Oh, there's one. Okay. All right. Have you listened to Arrested Mobility?
No.
You should listen to that. That's really good. I really enjoy his perspective. Anyway, here's my thing. The war on cars and how we need to eliminate this desire for cars, zoning that requires so many spaces and you could build on parking lots.
Exactly.
I get that. But now that cars are accessible, now everybody has a car. Anybody could get a car through car loans or used cars. It's plentiful of cars. Now there's a war on cars. Now that I can get a car, brown and Black people can get cars. And People are using it as a storage system, as a home, as a way to escape, to get out of their neighborhoods. Now it's like you're being penalized from traffic to, regulations. You can't park here, you get tickets and so forth. When I go to DC, parking is hell. So I'm just questioning people who are unhoused. Now they living in their car, and now you're going to take away the car. So
I guess I would challenge the notion that anybody can get a car. You can get a car loan, but then you're screwed over in a million different ways. Yeah, you can get a car, but I think a lot of people don't calculate how much that's going to cost you. It becomes a poverty tax because the gas costs the same for everybody. It's a very regressive form of tax. I mean, it really depends on the place. You really have to be specific about it, because that argument is sometimes used in New York in bad faith to hobble the deployment of bus lanes and transit improvements, saying that it's people in poverty who are driving. In New York, that is not the case. They take transit. It's overwhelmingly white collar people who drive. It's much more expensive, and you also have to live in the people who are driving are coming from the suburbs.
But there's now this push. People who can't afford to live in the city are now in the burbs. They're in my neighborhood. I'm in the burbs. There are more and more Black and brown people going out to the burbs because they can't afford to live in the city. It's because of that, and there's no transportation. Transportation is skimmed in the burbs. So you either walk everywhere or you get a car. And if you have a job in the city, you have to wake up 6 o'clock in the morning to get to work.
But that's because parking minimums have made it illegal to build the type of house, like literally illegal to build the type of housing in the place that the people want to live and work. You're forcing them to move to the suburbs because you didn't build enough housing, Or
it could be because of displacement. If you had a home and you're on public assistance, anytime that public assistance could be like, listen, you can't live here anymore. And your voucher's only good in the suburbs. This whole thing, this all depends, right? But
why is the voucher only good in the suburbs? See, that's a political problem. You know what I mean? Then you're forcing them to move to the suburbs.
But because they
didn't build enough stuff
house that only has less than 10% that allows vouchers, the other housing that you just built that has 97% market rate housing only has a few spots left and are very selective. Yeah, it is a government problem, but it's a problem that people are dealing with. You get what I mean?
No, I know. And exactly, because you can't fault people who have to drive because that we've built it. So you have to drive. What else are they going to do? It's in a lot of places, there just isn't transit service. And in a lot of places, you just can't live in the city. You have to live in the suburbs. That's a lot of the Bay Area that I went to Berkeley undergrad. So I'm very familiar with the fact that, people have been pushed from SF to Oakland, and then Oakland to Antioch, and then Antioch now all the way over to Stockton. It's crazy. But they're not building enough housing. And I'm not some of your listeners, I'm not like a market rate YIMBY. I think build a lot of housing and make it affordable housing.
Yeah.
Make it 80% affordable or 100%. It's ridiculous that we commodify housing. That's part of the crux of the issue is capitalism. And the fact that we have to have vouchers because we have such regressive taxation, because it's a whole host of issues that at this point, we need some serious changes in politics and the built environment to make any change. So it's to the person who has to sleep in their car, I'm not going to fault them for that, but the government sure tries to. In a lot of places, it's illegal to do that, which is hilarious. It's they force you to buy a car, and then they say,
and I mean, a car represents freedom. The car represents when you don't have anything else, and the only thing that you can control is your car. It's the only sane thing you have. I mean,
represents an economic unit of production. When you add up everyone buying one, it supports X, Y, and Z industry. Freedom, come on. Wait,
what are you talking about? Listen, if you don't have anything else, you can't control your home, you can't control your job. That's the
I know that's true. It's just bleak that we've done it that way because it's not mobility. It's certainly not mobility because it's traffic. It's just a tax. It's like you have to pay insurance, and then I love this. There's this a YouTuber I watch called City Nerd. He has this great thing about stroads. A stroad is obviously a mix between a street and a road. So a street is like a place where human activity happens. You live on the street, you do Sesame Street, you do stuff, your neighbors. A street is where stuff happens. And then a road is for transportation. right? So a strode is what we have in America. It's those big wide roads that have big old strip malls and car dealerships on either side, and like Friday or Chili's, Walmart. It's an abstract street kind of built for cars. And he talks about what he calls the indicator species. You're on a strode when, because he's saying it's a self-fulfilling or a self-sustaining ecosystem, because this thing is built for cars. There's restaurants, sure, but a lot of the businesses are car dealerships. There's oil change, there's Jiffy Lubes, there's big old, like this one near us, there's big old like top hat car washes. And then my favorite one was, he's like, and then the ultimate thing, billboards for personal injury and auto injury attorneys. I love it. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. It's like, this is like just a self-fulfilling piece of shit that we build, and the point is like not to provide a good life for people, it's to sell gas and cars. So 1930, there's the Great Depression, right? What pulls us out of the Great Depression is World War II and the immense need for, all the jobs it creates. People know the story. They're industrial manufacturing jobs. It's GE, it's Kaiser Shipyards, it's Boeing, it's Lockheed. These are the companies it's GM and Ford, Jeep, Chrysler. These are the companies that pulled us out of the Depression because we needed planes and boats and Jeeps and tanks. And when the war ends, suddenly the need for that dries up. The government wasn't exactly going to let this engine fail. It did stutter for a bit. There was a dip right after the war. But with the 49 Housing Act and with the 56 Federal Highway Act, they basically give cities carte blanche to rebuild for cars, rebuild with the automobile in mind. Because it wasn't that difficult for these industries to retool from making Jeeps to making personal cars, or for making, heavy equipment to making a refrigerator. And suburbanization, to some extent, was just a need. We needed to consumerize the economy. We needed to go from selling stuff to the military because we no longer needed that. We no longer needed that. We needed to go to selling stuff to us. We needed to become a consumer economy. And the way they chose to do it was, with the modernist principles of the time and the automobile and the faith in technology, et cetera. They went all in on the newest fad, the cars, because it represented freedom, because it's a simple idea to wrap your head around. It's like, yeah, it's a car, it can go anywhere, there's no tracks, I get it. But if everyone has one, it's like, it's a geometry problem. It's like, it doesn't work. And then they obviously weren't even thinking about the environment. I guess, I don't know if they viewed diesel as more futuristic than electric, but so the point I'm trying to make there was that this drive to suburbanize was also, to some extent, a capitalistic endeavor to keep the American economy going. Does that make sense?
Yes. I know I mentioned earlier about your architecture education.
Yes.
There are folks out there who are in school and aren't being taught this or have to learn this on their own. How was your education?
Try to be too negative. I mean, look, did we talk about these issues? No, I'm not going to say we did in any official capacity. The field of architecture as I was taught it. So I did poli-sci undergrad. I don't know if I got much out of that, although go Bears, I love Berkeley. But, that was just my own. But regardless, and then I worked I was a field organizer on the Obama campaign. I did politics before I got into architecture. So I politics. I was a low-level campaign staffer, but I was really interested in it. I did a master's at Columbia in architecture. I developed a portfolio and was able to get in, which was really cool. Very expensive. I would recommend, if you want to go to architecture school, I would look at Europe. TU Delft is great. ETH Zurich. They're expensive, but they're much less expensive than American schools.
Better education there too.
Yeah, there's UNAM. I am not saying that right, but the Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, beautiful campus, fantastic architecture school. Obviously, it's Mexico City and really cheap. So, but whereas Columbia was very, 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 very expensive. Jeez, and I have a prize from them, like an incubator prize, and it's like, whatever. I consider it a rebate. I'm seriously like, I'm going to be paying them for the next 15 years.
Oh my God.
It's ridiculous, but whatever. But yeah, to the point of whether or not any of this was talked about or what I'm interested in, no, not really. We really don't discuss history. What was great, I mean, it did give me the skills to like really critically, like I wouldn't trade what I learned in architecture school for anything. I mean, well, I don't know.
You think you should have went in urban planning instead?
No, I don't, because I don't think they should be separate fields. And I think the way that I did my architecture, what was great about it was that, they're very flexible and you can basically reject any prompt as long as you do it thoughtfully. And that was cool. So I was able to always focus on what I wanted to, which for me at the time was mostly transportation projects. I did a lot of train stations, which is fun. And just someday I do want to, I'm not licensed yet, but I'm getting my, I'm logging my hours, so many exams. Maybe I'll do it. I don't know. But yeah, no, I mean, it gave me, I said I wouldn't trade it for anything. I don't know if that's true because I might trade it for my student debt. That's the one-to-one. But no, I mean, it was a great experience. Because seriously, no, oh, right. And they had 2 joint architecture and urban planning studios. And I took both those. So I was able to like tailor it to what I wanted to some extent because I didn't, I didn't necessarily know what I wanted at the time. But no, I think seriously, architecture gives you the ability to understand space in a really personal and intimate level that I'm not sure if city planning does. But again, I don't think they should be separate fields. Like I think that to some extent, I think it's like a spectrum. Architecture is almost like a spectrum from like the scale of the body, furniture, up to the scale of the building, the block, up to the city, the region, then regional transportation. But I think architecture, by starting at those smaller scales, make sure you don't neglect them. Like people like Corb and the city plan. I mean, Corb claimed he was an architect, but whatever. But the city, I think that's a problem in the city planning field too, is they don't think about the small scale enough, and we end up with what we end up with. So I don't think they should be separate. But I think really like the specific skills that architecture teaches you, the ability to draw a thing, like a 3D thing, the ability to conceive of how you would think of that in 2D space is really useful for a lot of reasons. It helps me make my before and after things because I know how to draw something spatially to communicate in 2D because that's so useful because we do communicate visually in 2D so much with screens because we do have a fetishistic, artistic, I'm not saying that in a pejorative way. I'm saying that if that's all that's taught, then that's bad. But we want our stuff to be beautiful. And I guess I think that there's beauty in clarity of communication. Maybe some architects think otherwise. Like a good diagram, that's what I'm trying to get at. Like a good architecture diagram is a beautiful thing. Trying to communicate the most amount of information with the simplest amount of visual. So that's my positive thing about architecture education. There you go. And I'm not talking about like hand drafting. I suck at hand drawing. Everyone always asks, can you draw? It's like, no, but I can use Rhino pretty well. What I found a little frustrating was, well, this isn't positive, but what I found a little frustrating was just, there was more focus on architecture as object rather than as like a part of a city. The city planning department, I would assume, does great work, but we don't ever talk to them. It's very frustrating, I think, that the fields are so separate. And I think that's relatively recent. Architectural theorists would know more about this. We got kind of sheepish after urban renewal because they did such a bad job that architects are kind of afraid. Well, that's not so true anymore because now it's kind of urban renewal is kind of coming back it's just coming back. I don't know, like they're talking about this new plan for Penn Station where they're going to tear down a block south of Penn Station. It's like, oh yeah, great, that's a good idea. Sorry, that's just it's like, oh, you're going to fix Penn Station by tearing down more old stuff. Cool. One of them's like a 1750s church or something. It's ridiculous.
They like to tear down blocks. They like to just wipe everything out clean and build anew. Where do you think that came from?
That's a really good question. I love that question. I think actually there is like an answer that I can point you to. It might be a little outdated, but like I think Jane Jacobs, I know this is so cliche, but Jane Jacobs have you read The Death and Life of Great American Cities?
Not for a long time.
Yeah, because it's so intro, but it's a little repetitive and outdated. But it's a lot of it has its roots in a couple of different things. I mean, I'll start with Haussmann is probably the most obvious, is where where clearing the blocks came from. So Haussmann's renovation of Paris in the 1840s, I think. Napoleon III, I forget the exact date. It was in the middle of the 18th century. No, middle of the 19th century. Sorry, mid 1800s. Okay, now I've spent way too much time on trying to get the date right. Okay, Haussmann's renovation of Paris. There's a couple of interpretations as to why he did this, but from a 1,000-foot perspective, it's where the boulevards came from. So Haussmann, I think, ended up tearing down basically like 60% of medieval Paris. The reason that Paris looks so architecturally uniform, and I know there's going to be people who disagree with me on that, but from a whole, Paris is very architecturally uniform, is because most of the buildings were designed under or many of the buildings were designed in the purview of this dude, George Haussmann, Baron Haussmann. Most people think his first name was Baron. That was his title. His title was George, or his name was George. But he was a city planner, kind of more of a bureaucrat, hired by Napoleon III, who was Napoleon's like nephew. He was the emperor of the French Empire, the Second Empire. Oh yeah, I think that's where that phrase Second Empire comes from, because they had some taste. They did tear down that idea of like clearing whole blocks. A lot of it comes from him because he wanted to get rid of the medieval windy streets. There's different reasons for why people say, but there is a lot of evidence that it was a reaction to the Commune. So we already here are seeing the capitalistic origins of, or the anti-social origins of these wide boulevards. Because during the Commune, they were able to barricade the streets really easily and set up the Commune within France. And he didn't want that to be able to happen. So they made really wide boulevards that were difficult to do that. Now, the fact of the matter is so wide that we can't like really appreciate them 130 years later, or 160 years later, because they're not as wide as our stroads. But regardless, so that's one strain of where this sort of wholesale demolition comes from. So that Haussmann, as the planner, making Paris, which became the city of light, it was a devastating transformation, but it was successful. Paris rules, and he laid the foundation for making the subways possible by creating these rights of way. Now, I probably shouldn't be glorifying that because it did displace a lot of people, but racial. It was just anti-poor, unfortunately, which, is racial in a lot of ways, but it was but regardless. So Haussmann, I'll stop talking about Haussmann. That's one strain. So there's also the public health angle. There were various diseases. There's a specific one that I can't remember that was spreading at the time. I think it was TB and another one, and they thought it was caused by, germ theory wasn't fully developed yet. So they thought that disease was caused by bad air and people living too close together, which it to some extent is, but they're kind of not getting at the reasons right. So this idea of clearing out the whole block, that'll make it cleaner, will demolish the whole thing. It's for sanitation reasons. Corpus, so there's that public health part, because there were various plagues. They were always urban. You should look into this guy, Jon Snow, same name as the guy from Game of Thrones, but he is considered one of the first epidemiologists. But he was also to some extent like an urban analyst. He was London, and there was a big outbreak of like diphtheria or something, I forget. But he just went around London and found out where people got their water from, and then compared that to where the outbreak was, and found it was near wells where they had like open septic systems, so the water had been compromised. That resulted in a lot of public health measures. I guess that wasn't so relevant, but it's just to say that some things that seem obvious to us now aren't. Like, don't poop in the water. It's not that complicated. But so there's the public health reasons, and then that gets kind of combined almost with people like Corb and like kind of Buckminster Fuller, and the high modernists is what they're called. Because they talk a lot about sanitation, especially Corb. He's creep. He has all these weird exercise videos, So it becomes kind of like a combination of the two, of this grandiose central government planning, and then with this veneer of like public health, if that makes sense. And Corb was a fascist, so I think he loved these ideas, like his Plan Voisin. Well, I can't pronounce it, but for Central Paris, where they would tear down all of Central Paris, everything, and replace it with basically cruciform high-rise projects surrounded with with parks, with highways running through the middle. I think they loved that idea because fascists don't like diversity. And in the city, that was kind of a logical jump there. But the center city and the block represents something that some people hate. That the people living together and learning together, and you were talking in the one with Laura Foote about the salad. It's like, yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe the melting pot was a bad example because it implies like becoming something different rather than being ourselves with each other. But that's what they don't like. I don't know. And the block is like a unit. I mean, to some extent, suburbs don't really have blocks. They have windy nothings. They have the Ebenezer Howard. They got rid of blocks. That's why, for me, symbolically, I hate seeing structures that break the grid. You always see it in convention centers in the middle of American cities, like these big convention centers that like break the grid. They combined multiple grid lots. The point of the grid was everyone in a non-hierarchical fashion, and a fact that was easy to understand and travel. It's not just philosophical, it also works, But versus a radial Paris, which is all radial around the Louvre, like a radial, I think represents a much more, I'm just talking kind of idealistically about city form, but a radial like Tokyo, like Paris represents a much more hierarchical system. Not that they are, well, Tokyo is, but Paris has made France has made a lot of strides. They're obviously much more of a democracy than we are. The radial represents, again, I think a hierarchy, whereas the grid, like Philadelphia, New York, come on, basically every American city has the downtown grid. It's democratic. And I think William Penn even wrote about that. It's about everyone has access, an equal spot on the grid. And you can have like bigger streets and that helps with everybody. In the middle, you put City Hall, I guess. And that represents the power of the people. But it's not like every street leads to City Hall. Every street leads to other streets. Whereas the radial, it all goes in.
I wanted to start off with a quote. Originally, we had Whitney M. Young, but offline, we talked about that. And you have I don't want to say better quote. They're similar. Here's a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. It is increasingly clear to me that white flight was not a mystical process for which we have no real explanation or understanding. White flight was a policy of our federal, state, and local government. That policy held that Americans should enjoy easy access to the cities via the automobile and live in suburbs without Black people, who, by their very nature, degrade property and humanity.
Yeah, it sort of touches on all of it. What I like about the quote is it starts with it is increasingly clear to me because it's increasingly clear to me too as I do this project, because it's a process, right? It's an understanding because it's so systemic and complicated that it is a process of learning about. Again, I always talk about because it's federal, it affected every city of a certain size. The list is like 180. Can you even name 180 cities in America? I could say Springfield 150 times, right? Like 180 different cities, right? Because it is treated mystical process because people are like, and then white flight happened. Oh, why did the whites flee the suburbs? Because they developed suddenly a taste for what suburban living. Okay, what? So they came back from the war and suddenly their whole preferences changed? Maybe that could happen. Actually, that did happen in a lot of cases. But it was obviously incentivized. The GI Bill didn't give people mortgages in the center city. It gave them mortgages in the suburbs. So what is that? And who was able to live in the suburbs because those suburbs had restrictive covenants. While the Black soldiers and all branches and parts of the military, they were eligible for the GI Bill. They couldn't use it. They weren't allowed to go to these suburbs because they had the restrictive covenants, which say that in the deed, it has it written in the deed. And I talk about this on the account that the restrictive covenant writes into the deed that you can only sell this house to a quote member of the Caucasian race only. It's not a mystical process. That's what it is. It was policy. It was incentivization and policy. And the policy was, as he says, to change what the city was from a place where you live and work, where everyone lives and works, to just sort of like a commercial hub for suburban commuters. I think, and this is what I see now that I'm just looking at these patterns in all these different cities, like Boston, for instance. They've ripped out the heart of it and put a highway through and a bunch of parking and a new city hall and a bunch of office buildings for workers surrounded by parking. They tore down the houses. They changed the use of the land. They changed the use from half and half to 100% commercial. So that's like the second part of the quote. Suburban people should enjoy easy access to the city via the automobile because the automobile is a price to enter. It's again, I don't think not everyone has access to an automobile, and there's so many costs associated with it. So even if you do have access to an automobile, you can't always use it, with the volatility of gas and all the maintenance associated with it. So there's that. There's the second part of easy access to the city center via the automobile. So I think that sort of encapsulates this idea that, again, the city center, downtown, and downtown neighborhoods. Boston is what I'm thinking of. Again, the West End totally destroyed. Most of Roxbury totally destroyed. Well, not most of Roxbury, but the center of it in Dudley Square / and that's, I have a post about that with the Dudley Street Baptist Church. But it was about changing. So again, first part of why I like that quote is that it's not a mystical process, it's policy. And the policy was about changing the nature of what a city was. Of a city is now about commuting in to the car, doing some stuff, and getting the hell out. And then the third part of the quote is about how people of color, if you're not white, you degrade the property value. And that's the redlining. So the policy was to change the city into this different conception, and it was done on racial lines. And it was done, that the reason we have to separate is because the inherent nature of not being white degrades value. And there's no further, like, that is it. That's what they say on the redlining, the official comments. There is just a checkbox. Right? And one thing that people say a lot is like, oh, it was mostly white people in the redlined areas. It's like, okay, it depends on the city. And what are we talking about when we're talking about white? Because the definition really changed. Irish and Italians didn't used to be considered white. I'm Jewish. We've always been a bit on the fence, but I get to obviously enjoy all the benefits of whiteness. And I don't want to go into that, but sorry, the nature of what is white changed after World War II when they just drafted everyone except Black people, and that's when Irish and Italians just started they were just white now, which before they just weren't. We had a different conception. It's so funny on these redlining sheets. Have you ever seen the show Community? That asshole, what's his name? Chevy Chase.
Yeah.
That guy's a piece of shit. But apparently everyone hates like Britta, Jillian, whatever her name is. She really hates him. He was apparently like a terror to work with. Not surprising. But remember the character who plays his dad? And he's like so racist, he doesn't even talk to Britta, the blonde girl, because she's like, you're a Swede. And that's what it is on these redlining sheets. If you're not a WASP, that's it. You're redlined. So you look at these redlining maps and it's like, yeah, the whole city, like basically the whole island of Manhattan. It's like, what did you think was worth? What did you think was valuable if not Manhattan? I don't get it. But sorry, why did I say that? Right, because on these redlining sheets, the only place where there's like where it's just yes or no for a race is because everywhere else they have to like write it down. It's like and it gets really funny because it's like they're like there's Lithuanians, and it's like like how many Lithuanians even are there in the world? What do you have against Lithuanians? It's like it's so random. So that's why I like that quote, because it really just it has it's really good.
Going to your Instagram account, what's the most common question people have asked you?
That's also a good question. The most frustrating question is, where do you get satellite imagery from the 30s? It's like, okay, it was a camera mounted to the side of an airplane. It's not that complicated. And they pointed it down. I don't know what to say.
Aerial photograph.
Yeah, and I guess because I colorize it, people get confused. All I did was add blue. But whatever. What's the most common question? I get asked a lot about gentrification, but I know much less about that. And that's much more tied up in late stage capitalism. But I do get asked if what I'm talking about is gentrification. And actually, this is the question I get asked a lot, because people say like, you're talking about gentrification. I'm not. I'm talking about setting up the conditions that led for gentrification to happen in the first place. For instance, like Society Hill in Philadelphia. I mean, I should use an easier example. Williamsburg gentrified, and the people got displaced. I'm kind of just spitballing here. Gentrification to some extent is the reverse. That's been happening since the 80s. Is people moving back into downtowns and then kicking out the people who were able to stay and survived that initial urban renewal wave. Like the South Bronx is a great example, because that's in Harlem, obviously, because they tore a lot of Harlem down. So they tear these places down, and then sometimes provide project housing, but then the houses that they don't tear down become so much more valuable later, because we then realize we shouldn't have torn them down, and then that's when the people who were saved or were lucky enough to not have their stuff turned down, that's when gentrification, and that's the problem with gentrification, because then when folks move back to the city and they're like, we're not going to live in a NYCHA high rise. They want to live in these beautiful houses, and that's when the pressure goes in. And unless you have rent control, you're priced out. San Francisco is a perfect example of that. The Victorian houses were viewed as slums. The painted ladies were viewed as slums. It's just because they fell out of fashion for a little while, but now they're literally the symbol of the city. Most of Western Addition was torn down, but some Western Addition was a Black neighborhood in San Francisco. It's pretty much not there anymore, and it's been broken up into a lot of sub neighborhoods, but a lot of it was torn. It was Victorians, it was just vernacular houses. That's what they built, was the Victorians, because that was their style. In Brooklyn and the East Coast, they had the brick style, which is also gorgeous, obviously. And now, on both coasts, those old row houses are beautiful. And I was showing you the example in the Netherlands. They look similar. It's like they're a similar scale, and people love them there, and they love them here now. But the ones that didn't make it. And because that vernacular historic architecture was in the historic city, was in the center city, where there were where it was diverse. There were people of color because there was everybody because that's where the jobs were. When they redline these neighborhoods, gentrification is a different phenomenon. What I'm talking about is why we set it up such that there is this situation where we have undervalued land in the middle of the city. We have this situation because it's people of color that live there. And we undervalue that through policy and through appraisals and blah, blah, blah. Gentrification is people coming back to those areas that we devalued for so long. But there were still people there and they still lived there and they were homeowners or long-time renters, and trying to kick the people out because we're saying, we love these buildings, not you, get out. Whereas back in the day, it was, we don't want you and fuck those buildings,
Do you think cities are a problem with the highways and with everything? Do you think it's a problem? Do you propose a solution to this trauma? And I think these cities were traumatized.
To the question of do I think that cities are a problem? Cities are the only thing that will save us. A well-designed city is the most efficient way for humans to live. And efficiency is the worst thing I could have said. It is the most environmentally, because efficiency, the pursuit of efficiency has led to some pretty terrible things, but it is the most environmentally, if we do it right, it's how we can achieve the least carbon emissions while producing the most happiness, and there's endless, obviously, and this is just cliche, but Copenhagen, Amsterdam, they have their problems, absolutely, but they're just on a different level so the American city is a problem. Yes, I would say every single American city, New York included, right now is undergoing a crisis in multiple forms. Every city right now has an emergency. I mean, in the Bronx right now, we are spewing particulate matter on hundreds of thousands of people. 1 in 5 people, I think it's 1 in 5. I have a graphic. Every census block in the Bronx is in the 99th percentile for asthma rates. Everyone. And yeah, there's confounding factors, but it's because you surrounded the community in a wall of highways. And you also got rid of all the electric streetcars and you made everything diesel. You forced a car down every street. Every single city has a public health emergency right now that we're just not doing anything about. Cars crashing into buildings. It's and on the news, it's it's so funny. One person was seriously injured. It's and okay, that person's life was ruined. American cities are a public health disaster every moment, every minute, every day, including New York. They surrounded the island in highways. They cut Brooklyn, Queens in half with the BQE. Yeah. No, there's Houston needs to be, everyone needs to stop and they need to take a moment and just make a plan, fix it. We can't do that under capitalism, but it's every single city. And we're moving actively, except for a couple places. See, I don't want to be a bummer, but every place is moving in the wrong direction. Every single place, except Rochester, New York, except actually New York, basically. But California, I'll get back to New York because there are some good things happening there. Not the city, the state. California, their most recent budget, they cut transit funding 8%, increased highway funding 30%. California, Democrats in control of every chamber. What? Every American city, every single one, the positive ones, I'll say the positive. Rochester, New York had an orbital freeway around it that I can show you the images, but I'll try to describe it. It was a typical Rochester dense downtown. Rochester has the brilliant distinction. Rochester, New York is the only city in the world to have had an electric subway system, a subway system, and to have abandoned it. Rochester had a subway and they abandoned it. Those things, that we spend billions and billions of dollars and claim we want. Cleveland has a different, they started building a subway, but they never finished that. So that's different for the folks who know what I'm talking about. But so Rochester, dense downtown, dense enough to support a subway system, back when those were private companies that needed to make a profit, dense downtown, and they tore it down for a highway. They built an orbital highway and the befores and afters are really startling for Rochester. They basically flatten all of downtown and they build an orbital highway and they get rid of the subway. But recently they have demolished the orbital highway. And I want to make a distinction here between this project and something like the Big Dig, because the Big Dig, what they did was they buried the highway. In Rochester, they demolished it and they repaired the grid and they rebuilt housing, affordable housing. Specifically, there's not enough of it, but they built some. It's better than nothing. They repaired the grid and they put it back to what it was, because that's what we need to do. It's not rocket science. It's basic urban planning. We've been doing it for a while. And then the other example, also New York State, is Syracuse, although I'm not as familiar. because Syracuse, they are tearing down they also have a highway that cuts right through, and they're tearing that down. And their project is actually called the community grid because they're repairing the grid. And I love that. I love the focus on repairing the grid because that's what the highway does. It breaks the grid. And I told you earlier how. So those two are positive. I would make, again, the distinction between the big dig, because the big dig doubled down on that, changing the paradigm. Like your downtown is still for a tunnel for cars, and they still spill onto the street. And, they built the deck. It's a deck. It's not actually a tunnel for parts of it. So you can't even plant trees because the roots can't go that deep. Like, it's a deck. It's a lame project, and they didn't build the north-south connection. So Rochester and Syracuse, those are good examples. Internationally, there's some great examples. That example because Paris is maybe not a great example, never really tore themselves down for the car, but they have been reclaiming space, like that riverfront highway that I showed you. But then actually probably the best example is Seoul. Although now that I'm thinking about it, maybe Rochester is the best example. But Seoul is cool because Seoul, South Korea, they had a big elevated highway that cut right through the middle of their city, and everyone hated it. It was built over an old stream, and then the stream got so dirty because they built the highway that it basically became an open sewer. And this is a big, long highway. People hated it. And in the 90s, they tore it down, but they didn't just tear it down. They built, because people are always like, well, how are people going to get to work? Well, they built 2 subway lines along the same path, or along parallel routes. So they weren't taking something away. Like, that's what was cool about this project, because a lot of the times drivers feel like we want to take something, like I want to take something away. But in Seoul, they got rid of the highway, but they replaced it with 2 lines. And then they also, now the right of way is like the park. It's like the High Line. It's their High Line. It's like the place you go in Seoul. So it just worked on so many levels by just getting rid of the highway, not spending so much money to put all these crazy tunnels underground, and building tunnels for private cars is just wildly inefficient. You build a tunnel, you put a train in it, Elon. But okay, so that's what I'll say.
You have a Patreon. What does that help you do?
But a lot of the aerial images are taken by private surveyors, so they're just not public. There's a site I use. I love them, but they are very expensive. The people who work there are super nice though. But it's called historicaerials.com. I encourage everyone to go to it. There's watermarks over it unless you buy it. It's a Google Earth time machine. It's only for the United States, and the quality varies a lot. But your bigger cities, and even a lot of smaller ones, you can go to 1940 and just see what it was like. So high quality too. You can zoom and see the trams. I love that. You can see you can see the city functioning, but they're not free because they were private surveyors. So, and a lot of them just aren't in the public domain. But so what this company has done is sort of bought the licenses for all of them and consolidated it, and then I can buy it from them. So that's what I use the Patreon money for, and then also they have different qualities. So I can get a photo of Philly at 1600 by 1600 JPEG or pixels for $15. That's not useful for what I'm doing. I need the full quality, because you see how far I zoom in, and those are $90 up. So that's what the Patreon helps me for. And those base aerials basically become the base for everything. I mean, if you look on the Instagram, it's what I overlay the transit maps onto. It's it's the before and after. I mean, that's what it was like. It's truly awesome. But it's, that's how I do those wipes is, those wipes of the highway, like showing the highway going. All that is 2 super high quality aerial images that I colorized and fixed up and removed clouds and whatnot. But then there's just a wipe transition. It's just a before and after. And then I just zoom in and pan to make it look cool. But that's all it is. All of those are those 2 images. Those are what I buy from historical aerial. So that's how I do those graphics, is I buy those $90 and then do the colorization and then do the overlay. And then those aerials are where, because I don't live in these places. I can only live in one place. I know the Bay Area and New York specifically well because of my personal experiences. Why these images are so useful, and why it's because there's no lying. This is just the image. This is what happened. This is just before and after. It's not filtered through. I can eliminate any politics or any preconceived notion or any narrative, and that's very important, any preconceived narrative, because there's always a narrative about these projects in the local community that I don't know, because I try to look into it, obviously, but going into it, I don't know. But what's awesome about these images is these are just the city, how it was over the years. no interpretation, nothing. So that's, and just when I colorize and look, that's where I find. I didn't know about Eastwick until I was like, what the hell is that neighborhood that just disappears when I add the 1981 layer? What happened there? It's really interesting. Sorry, but the Patreon is because they're expensive, but they're the base, and they form, like, I pore over these for like hours because this is what is the base. And if you see on the Instagram, I actually use those as like my almost like table of contents for what I'm going to post. Like I have a post that is that aerial image, or is two of the aerial images showing the before and after with just like upcoming posts.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Okay, I'm sorry. This was so much fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. This was, like I said, this was really fun.
Okay, thanks. Bye. Listeners, I have an exciting announcement. I decided to launch a membership program for the show, where you have a chance to support me and the show directly. I love creating the show, and it means the world to me that you all tune in to keep hearing me week after week. But it takes an immense amount of time and energy to produce. I want to keep the show going, and I want to invest in its growth. And I also want you to become a partner with me in this journey. That's why I'm excited to give you a chance to officially become a supporter of the show at glow.fm/archispolly, ARCHISPOLLY, or by clicking the link in the show notes. It's quick and easy. It takes less than 30 seconds and just takes clicking a link in the show notes and using Apple or Google Pay. You don't have to create any new logins, and you can contribute as much or as little as you like. If this show is part of your day or week and you like what I'm doing, then visit glow.fm/archispolly, all one word, and support me and the show in any way you can today.